This forum has taken us across a very interesting phase of the development in the way in which Australian foreign policy has been made, and we're very fortunate to have had among our participants some of the significant players from the 1960s and 70s, such as Bob Furlonger, Pierre Hutton, Jim Ingram, Jeff Miller, Gary Woodard, Philip Flood, Jeremy Herder, Mac Williams and Andrew Farron. This is a very impressive lineup and we're grateful for their contributions to our discussion today. More particularly, I want to emphasise how their period in the service of this country marked a great period of development in our progress towards being a mature member of the international community. I've become very interested in Prime Minister Alfred Deakin, particularly the way in which his thinking developed in the 1890s and his role in imperial conferences. And you could see that he was beginning to detach Australia from Britain when he got the bright idea that we should stop paying the Royal Navy for our naval defence and put the money into Australian ships. Well, of course, the Brits didn't like it and they weren't going to help. But he was smart enough to send a personal invitation to Teddy Roosevelt to send the Great White Fleet to Sydney and to Melbourne. And boy, did that have an effect on public opinion. Well, that's just one of the many, many steps we had to take towards maturity. And of course, we're not really fully there yet, but we're not doing too badly. But this period of the 1960s and 70s, I think, marked a great step forward. I cut my teeth on the way Australian foreign policy is made when I had the opportunity as official historian of the Korean War to read the files on all the key decisions of that era held by the departments of Prime Minister and Cabinet, External Affairs, Defence, the Armed Services and various other Australian government agencies. Our participation in that war was very much an act of foreign policy rather than of defence policy, led in the crucial year of 1950-51 by External Affairs Minister Percy Spender. His strategic aim had little to do with the conflict in the Korean Peninsula. His intention was to exploit the crisis in order to gain a formal alliance with the United States, despite the scepticism of his Prime Minister Menzies. And this is another very interesting example of how you can't just classify Menzies as being authoritarian or a controlling agent in foreign policy generally. He knew what Spender was about. He said, Percy, forget it. You'll never get an alliance with the United States. But he didn't bar Spender from attempting it. And Spender, being the marvellously astute politician that he was, converted a courtesy call on Harry Truman to a one-hour discussion and came out the door with Truman saying, yes, I think we want Australia as a formal ally. Atchison, fix it. Now, it took a little longer to actually bring home, but it happened. And Menzies had the grace to call Spender in, and he opened a very special bottle of scotch, and they celebrated the event. As I got further into the Korean War research, I discovered how vigorous the debates were, particularly within the Department of External Affairs. And there were a lot of things to debate: the crossing of the 38th parallel, the advance to the Yalu River, the way in which the war was conducted in 1951, and so on, which showed, I think, a very healthy detachment, objectivity, maturity, and above all, knowledge on the part of the people in external affairs who were doing it. Unfortunately, these arguments were not carried upwards into inter-allied diplomacy, and we behaved in the 1950s more as a group of yes men than as independent partners. During the 1960s, this strategy continued to be in effect, but with some attenuation as our senior diplomats and public servants became more experienced and the world generally became a more complicated place for the governments of medium and smaller powers to develop their policies in. But at least during the 1960s, we were becoming increasingly aware that our national interests were not identical with those of our major ally. If we continued to act as though they were, our government would run out of credibility and support at home, while being unable to live up to the hopes and expectations of our major ally abroad. And of course, as Geoffrey Bolton and Peter Edwards have shown us this morning, that is exactly what happened to the Liberal National Party government during those years. The decade began with a very promising Foreign Minister, Garfield Barwick, and he, I'm interested to discover, in the opinion of many of you who knew him well, wins the prize for being the best Australian Foreign Minister of the 1960s. I knew him a little when he was president of this institute. I was on the National Council, and he was very impressive in the way in which he ran things, and he did not get his hands on the detail. I mean, like a good chairman, he stood back. He had a very good chief executive officer and in the form of Tom Miller, and let Tom get on with it. And that's the way boards should work. And he would lend his weight and influence to the Institute when it needed it in particular tight spots. So I can understand why the Department of External Affairs valued him so highly. Reports on Paul Hasluck are much more mixed, of course, and I think some of the pen pictures we've had from various of the expert historians as well as the diplomats who worked with him during the day have really said a lot. And I think we've got this all on tape, haven't we? And we'll be able to edit that and I think produce something from multiple sources that will complement Jeff Bolton's work when it appears. Australia began the decade with some well-designed policies under the leadership of Barwick, advised by his departmental head Arthur Tang, a man with a deep insight into our interests, our needs and the dangers to which we had exposed ourselves. Tang, and it was not just Tang, we should also remember that he took quite a lot of senior people from external affairs across to defence with him, people like Bill Pritchett and Gordon Jockle and Bob Hamilton, and they did the hard strategic policy analysis, and Tang was able to build it into something that he could use at political level. Barwick's successor, Hasluck, was inclined to follow Menzies' lines of policy rather than think out new ones for new circumstances, and I think that is the chief weakness in his period. Tang was unfortunate to be sidelined by Menzies and Hasluck and was sent off to New Delhi for 4 years. In the mid-1960s showed how dominant the political actors were, especially Menzies, Hasluck, and let's not forget Poltridge, in terms of forming and implementing Australian foreign policy. Tensions remained between these leading ministers and the Department of External Affairs, but without Tang, the department lost some of its vital leverage that it needed in the late 1960s. The situation changed in the early 1970s, even before the coalition lost office, when Tang was brought back from New Delhi to become the Secretary of the Department of Defence. He set about introducing some wide-ranging and much-needed reforms that have generally stayed in place since he made them, and it's given us a much more independent capacity for strategic analysis. It's just sad that we haven't used it more effectively in the first decade of the 21st century. In these remarks, I've focused on foreign policy and those who've shaped it directly. I must not omit some other groups in our democratic society that have also played a role in forming our foreign policy in the 1960s and 70s, namely the media, academia, including the think tank embodied by the Australian Institute of International Affairs, and public opinion. During the 1950s, we began to develop a group of journalists who were expert in regional affairs, men such as Dennis Warner, Peter Hastings, and Donald Horne, to name but a few. The 1960s and 70s were decades of major opportunity for them, and we read their writings with real interest, not least because they illuminated the ways in which governments of the region developed their foreign and defence policies, and how well or ill the countries of the region governed themselves. The development of television further reinforced the influence of the media on the way we thought about foreign policy through the 1960s. As the universities grew in their capacities for research and teaching on Southeast Asian affairs, so academics became strong leaders in the public debate. I think particularly of men such as John Legg, I'm very sorry he couldn't be here today, Herb Feith, Jamie Mackey, Heinz Arndt, Tom Miller, and Steve Fitzgerald. There are many others that I could add to this list, but I have to move on. As public opinion became more directly engaged in the national debates on foreign and defence policy, so special groups arose, concerned with issues such as the Vietnam War, conscription, relations with Indonesia, and human rights. Most of us remember the age of public demonstrations and moratorium marches which demonstrated the tensions between the government and major sections of the electorate on which they depended for re-election. As we've seen during the past decade, Australian public opinion has remained active in demonstrating its views on international policies. Governments which defy public wishes in a spectacular way, as did the Howard government in 2003 over Iraq, will eventually have to bear heavy political costs. Bridging all these and other groups of the 1960s was the Australian Institute of International Affairs. With the foundation of the Federal Director's Office in 1963, the Institute went from being a collection of disparate state-based organisations to become a national body well connected in Canberra with a much higher public profile. An essential contributor to the success was its first director, Alan Watt, former Secretary of the Department of External Affairs and holder of a number of senior ambassadorial posts. The leadership and momentum that Alan Watt built up during his 6 years of tenure were sustained by his successor Tom Miller, who was in office from 1969 to 1976. The quality of the national conferences, the journal, and the Institute's other publications like Australia in World Affairs all built up over the years and made its name around the world. The Institute has become braver and more skilled in the field of fundraising. We have advanced to having a younger director, and I call that an advance because with a younger director you get full-time commitment and career ahead. With someone who is retired, you know they're only going to be there for a few years, and there's generally less energy and foresight involved. We have also seen a number of initiatives in recent years, particularly the initiation of the Institute's fellowship program, which is a brilliant idea. The Institute can look around Australia and say, who do we want to bring into our ranks? And if they've got the right credentials, experience and potential, then we can make them a fellow and bring them in. And when you look at the list of fellows elected in recent years, I think it's added a tremendous amount to the Institute's strength, and full marks, Melissa, for that result. This has made the Institute very effective in terms of exerting a strong presence in the continuing national debate on foreign policy. Finally, as a historian, let me record my satisfaction at seeing such a strong group of historians taking part in this forum. I shan't name the 15 or so historians that, whose names I see on the lists of speakers and participants, but I'm delighted to see them all and to have been enriched by their knowledge and judgments on our subject of the past day's discussions, and I look forward very much to their contribution to the book that we hope will come out of all this labour.